They were sent to observe a promised land, but what did they really find? Giants, fortified cities, or something even more impossible to explain. What did the Israelite spies really see, and why did they return terrified?
Shalom, shalom. Welcome back for another week to your channel, Mishnah TV. There is a detail in Parashat Shelaj that, if one does not pay close attention, goes unnoticed. Yet it may well be one of the most devastating psychological and spiritual errors in the entire Torah. For, curiously enough, the problem with the spies did not begin in Canaan. It did not start when they saw giants. It was not born in the face of fortified cities or before powerful nations. The true problem began much earlier. It began in the way they viewed themselves. The story seems simple. 12 leaders are sent to scout the promised land. And here lies something fascinating. These were no ordinary people. The Torah emphasizes that they were *nisi'im, leaders, men of stature, representatives of every tribe, the spiritual and political elite of Israel, the very people in whom everyone placed their trust. They return after 40 days and confirm something extraordinary. The land is indeed good. It is fertile. It flows with milk and honey. They even bring back gigantic fruits as evidence. But then a small word appears, a tiny word that alters the destiny of an entire generation. But. Yes, the land is good, but its inhabitants are strong. Yes, the promise exists, but we will not be able to fulfill it. And here, the collapse begins. For Shelaj is not merely a story about a failed espionage mission. It is a story about narrative, about how a nation can lose a battle before it is even fought, about how leaders can take actual facts, reframe them through the lens of fear, and transform a mere difficulty into an absolute impossibility. Perhaps the most tragic line of all is this: in our own eyes, we were like grasshoppers. Observe the sequence. First, they perceived themselves as small, and only then did they assume that the enemy perceived them as small too. And perhaps that is one of the most uncomfortable questions raised by this parasha. How many times in our lives has God already opened a door for us, yet we chose not to enter, because before ever facing the giant, we had already convinced ourselves that we were nothing more than grasshoppers? This is Abel Flores, investigative journalist for Mishnah TV. Thank you very much for subscribing to the channel and giving us a like. Also, don't forget to visit us at our website, lawmishnah.com, where you will find much more content, including our free course covering the entire Mishnah in your own language. There is a phrase in Parashat Shelaj that appears to be a mere narrative detail, yet in reality it serves as an X-ray of the human soul. The spies return from the promised land and declare, "In our own eyes we were like grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes." Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. Now listen closely. For here, Jewish tradition offers an extraordinarily astute insight. The Talmud, in *Sota, *35a, poses a question almost journalistic in nature. How did the spies know how the Canaanites perceived them? They could certainly know how they themselves felt, but they could not enter the minds of others. Rav Mesharshia arrives at a devastating conclusion. They lied. And they did not necessarily lie about the facts. Yes, there were fortified cities. Yes, there were giants. The problem lay elsewhere. The problem was one of interpretation. First, they felt small, and then they projected that sense of smallness onto the enemy. Observe the psychological sequence. They did not merely say, "they are enormous." They said, "we are insects." And when a people begins to describe itself as an insect, Defeat has already begun before the battle has even started. This is the true sin of the narrative. For the most dangerous lie does not always involve fabricating false data. Sometimes it takes real facts and emotionally reconfigures them until they are transformed into utter hopelessness. From the traditional perspective, this was not merely a case of low self-esteem. It was a fracture of emunah, of trust. We are speaking of a generation that witnessed the sea part, ate manna from the heavens, and walked beneath divine clouds, yet interpreted reality as if God had abandoned history. And here, Shelach becomes painfully contemporary. For today, too, there exist narratives that diminish us. Individuals, societies, and even leaders who transform real challenges into absolute verdicts. It cannot be done. It is impossible. We are not ready. But the Torah seems to whisper something both uncomfortable and profound to us. Beware of the stories you tell yourself about yourself. For more often than not, it is not the giant that defeats you. First, you defeat yourself when you begin to see yourself as a lobster. There is a word in Parashat Shelaj that often gets lost in translation, yet perhaps therein lies hidden the true sin of the spies. The Torah states, "And they spread among the children of Israel an evil report concerning the land they had explored." Bamidbar 13:32. In Hebrew, the expression is *dibat haaretz. And here we must pause, for *diba* does not simply mean report or account. It is not a technical datum. It is not a neutral analysis. Diba* signifies something far weightier: defamation, slander, a narrative that destroys. And this completely alters our reading of the episode. For the problem was not merely that the spies spoke negatively about the land. The problem lay in how they took reality and reinterpreted it. Observe something fascinating. They did not invent all the facts. The land did possess fortified cities. There were mighty peoples. The descendants of Anak did exist. The challenges were real. But then occurs the most dangerous leap in the entire narrative. They shifted from describing obstacles to fabricating an absolute conclusion. They did not say, "It will be difficult." They said, "We cannot do it." And therein lies the sin. For the most effective lie does not always consist of inventing false facts. Sometimes it operates in a much more sophisticated manner. It takes true data, emotionally rearranges it, and constructs an interpretation designed to instill fear. That is propaganda. The information does not vanish. It is manipulated. And here, Shelach ceases to be ancient history and becomes a contemporary mirror. How often does this occur in our own lives? We encounter a real challenge, a legitimate difficulty, an objective crisis, and suddenly we transform a "this will be difficult" into a "this is impossible." The Torah seems to offer us a warning regarding something profoundly human. Not every report is neutral. There are narratives that build a future, and narratives that paralyze. For when fear interprets the facts, even the promised land can appear uninhabitable. And perhaps Shelaj's uncomfortable question is this: are we reading our reality, or are we slandering our own future? There is an uncomfortable question in Parashat Shelaj that commentators have debated for centuries, and it is this: was it truly right to send spies? For if one reads the Torah carefully, one encounters something strange. In Bamidbar, Numbers, it appears that God himself issues the command, "Shalach lecha anashim," send men to scout the land. Everything seems quite clear. But later, in Devarim, Deuteronomy, when Moses recounts these events 40 years later, he tells a different version. It was the people who asked to send scouts before entering Canaan. And therein lies the problem. Whose idea was it? God's or the people's? And as is often the case in Jewish tradition, the contradiction is not avoided, it is studied. Rashi, one of Judaism's most influential commentators, makes an extraordinary observation regarding the phrase "shalach lecha." It literally means "send for yourself." That is to say, act according to your own judgment. Rashi offers a very bold interpretation. God was not commanding this mission as an ideal. Rather, he was saying, if you wish to send them, go ahead. I do not need it, but you do. It is a profoundly human idea, and if we are honest, a somewhat unsettling one as well, for it implies something of significant theological weight. God can permit human decisions without necessarily granting them his full approval. Has this never happened to you? You insist so adamantly upon something that eventually life seems to say, very well, do it, and learn from it. Now, not all sages interpret the text in the same way. The Ramban, Nachmanides, introduces a more strategic perspective. He accepts that it was the people who requested the spies, yet he does not view the act of conducting military reconnaissance as a lack of faith. On the contrary, any responsible nation requires strategic intelligence before entering into a war. And here, the Ramban teaches us something important. Faith does not equate to improvisation. Trusting in God does not obviate the need for planning. It is not a matter of choosing between spirituality and strategy. The problem, according to him, lay not in scouting the land itself, but rather in the asterisk purpose with which they returned. The reconnaissance mission was meant to serve the cause of conquest, but ultimately it served only to justify fear. And then Sforno appears with a fascinating interpretation. He emphasizes that the envoys were meant to be chosen by Moses, not manipulated by popular anxiety. Why? Because when collective fear takes hold of a mission, even the most objective data ends up contaminated. In other words, the problem was not the investigation itself. The problem was who interpreted the information, and from what emotional state. And perhaps that is the eternal question of Shelach. For all of us, in one way or another, send spies into the future. We investigate opportunities, analyze risks, and assess dangers. The question is not whether we should observe reality. The question is this: are we exploring in order to build a promise, or are we seeking arguments to abandon it? Now, there is a deeply mistaken notion we often harbor regarding faith. We think that trusting in God means closing our eyes, ignoring the risks, and forging ahead as if reality did not exist. But Parashat Shelaj, compels us to ask a much more sophisticated question. Does faith eliminate strategy, or does it require it? For there is a fascinating detail here. Judaism has never condemned espionage in and of itself. In fact, years later, Joshua, would also dispatch spies before entering Jericho, and no one considered it a sin. Thus, the question becomes inevitable. If Yehoshua did the very same thing, why did it end in tragedy in Shelach? The answer is as simple as it is profound. In Jericho, espionage served the cause of conquest. In Shelach, it ended up serving the cause of evasion. That is the decisive point. Investigating a problem in order to solve it is not the same thing as investigating it to justify why you will never attempt to solve it. For it is one thing to say, we need information in order to enter, and it is quite another to say, let's look for evidence to prove that entering is impossible. The difference seems slight, yet it alters the destiny of an entire generation. The Jewish tradition grasps something extraordinarily balanced. Faith and strategy are not enemies. Analyzing risks is not a lack of trust. Prudence, too, is a spiritual virtue. A doctor studies before operating. An architect calculates before building. A general surveys the terrain before battle. No one calls such preparation a lack of faith. The problem arises when prudence morphs into paralysis, when analysis ceases to serve action and begins instead to manufacture excuses. That is why Shelach leaves us with 4 almost eternal principles. Spying in order to plan can be an act of wisdom. Spying in order to seek excuses is corrosive. Analyzing risks is prudence, but transforming real risks into absolute impossibility, that is nothing short of rebellion. And perhaps herein lies one of the most mature lessons of the spiritual life. Faith does not consist of denying the existence of giants. Faith consists of facing them head on, without allowing them to define the magnitude of your promise. Now, there is something deeply unsettling about the story of the spies and Parashat Shelaj, and that is that the disaster did not begin among ignorant, impulsive, or marginalized people. No, the crisis began at the very top. The Torah makes a deliberate effort to underscore this. It states, all of them were men, heads of the children of Israel. And here, the Hebrew is revealing. The word *anashim, men, in rabbinic parlance, does not simply mean adult males. It is often used to describe important, distinguished individuals, people of moral stature and leadership. In other words, the spies were not anonymous agitators. They were the elite, tribal leaders, respected men, authoritative voices, people whose words shaped the collective perception. And precisely for this reason, the damage was so devastating. For when an ordinary person feels fear, the impact is limited. But when a leader transmits fear, that fear multiplies. Here lies a mechanism that is profoundly human, yet also deeply political. The people never saw Canaan themselves. They saw only the report of those who had been there. The nation relied on mediation. It relied on interpretation. And then something tragic occurs. Those called upon to expand the people's horizons end up narrowing them instead. The leaders who should have said, yes, there will be challenges, but we will move forward, ended up saying, we cannot. And an entire generation emotionally collapsed. Shelaj compels us to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. A nation can survive external enemies for a very long time, but it can hardly survive when its own leaders teach it to fear itself. For leadership does not merely manage facts, it manages meaning. A leader does not simply report what he sees, he teaches how to interpret what is seen. And herein lies the drama. The spies possessed credentials, prestige, tribal representation, and symbolic authority. All of this made their message even more dangerous. The people did not follow the fear because it was irrational. They followed it because it came backed by trustworthy individuals. And perhaps that is one of Shelaj's most urgent lessons. Beware of leaders who magnify giants and diminish souls. For a people rarely falls first due to a lack of resources. More often, it falls because someone in authority taught it to lose hope. So, there is something fascinating and also profoundly dangerous about human leadership. Very few people react directly to reality. Most of us react to an asterisk interpretation of reality. And that is exactly what happens in Parashat Shelaj. The people of Israel never saw Canaan. They never saw the fortified cities. They never saw the giants. They never walked those territories. The only ones who saw them were the spies. And that signifies something enormous. The entire nation depended on a narrative mediation. It depended on how others would tell the story. Here emerges a political, psychological, and spiritual mechanism that continues to function in exactly the same way thousands of years later. First, leaders observe reality. Then, they take what they see and translate it into words. Next, those words are transmitted to the community. The community internalizes that interpretation. And finally, collective emotion transforms into a historical decision. Observe what happened in Shelaj. The spies saw a land that was complex, challenging, difficult, but possible. However, upon their return, they did not deliver mere data. They delivered an emotion. They transformed observation into fear, and that fear became contagious. In a matter of hours, a people who had just departed from Egypt began to weep, to despair, and to speak of turning back. The private fear of a few individuals escalated into a national crisis. That is leadership multiplying emotions. And in this regard, Shelaj becomes extraordinarily modern. For even today, societies undergo this very same process. Most people do not directly witness major threats, economic crises, conflicts, or historical shifts. They encounter them through leaders, media outlets, authorities, and influential voices. And so the decisive question arises: who is interpreting reality for us? For leadership is never neutral. A leader does not merely manage facts. A leader manages meanings. They do not merely report what is happening. They teach us how to feel about what is happening. They can look at a challenge and say, we are finished. Or they can say, it will be difficult, but we can do it. The facts may be the same. The story changes through interpretation. And perhaps that is one of Shelaj's most profound warnings. A nation rarely collapses solely because of its enemies. Often, it collapses when those with the loudest voices turn fear into destiny. Now, there is an uncomfortable question in Parashat Shelaj that demands intellectual honesty. Did the spies lie, or did they tell the truth? And the answer, as is often the case in the Torah, is more complex than it appears. For if we read the text carefully, we discover something surprising. The spies did not invent everything. The land was fertile. The cities were indeed fortified. There were powerful peoples. Even Caleb, the great opponent of the pessimistic report, never contradicts these facts. He does not say, there are no giants. He does not say, the walls do not exist. He does not accuse the spies of fabricating reality. The only thing Caleb contradicts is the conclusion, and he utters an extraordinary phrase. Let us go up, for we shall surely be able to overcome it. Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. And here emerges one of the deepest debates of the asterisk parashah. The conflict is not between reality and fantasy. It is between two ways of interpreting the same reality. Two hermeneutics, two spiritual lenses. The 10 spies observe the facts and conclude, the reality is too vast. We cannot do it. Caleb and Joshua look at the exact same facts and say something completely different. Yes, it will be difficult, but the promise redefines how we interpret the challenge. Observe how profound this is. They are not denying the problem. They are denying the fatalism. For it is one thing to acknowledge the giants, and quite another to surrender to them before even beginning. The rabbinic tradition understands that therein lay the sin. It was not simply a matter of reporting difficulties. It was replacing trust with despair, exchanging prudence for a definitive verdict. They did not merely say, there will be obstacles. They said, we cannot do it. And that phrase changed the destiny of a generation. For there exists a particularly dangerous type of lie, the partial truth. The truth used in such a way that it produces a false conclusion. Yes, the facts were real, but the interpretation was tainted by fear. And perhaps here, Shelaj confronts us with something deeply personal. For we all do this at some point. We see real obstacles, real wounds, real limitations, and we begin to tell ourselves a definitive story. I can't. This will never change. It's too big for me. But Caleb seems to whisper to us from the biblical text, beware. Sometimes the problem isn't the giant. Sometimes the problem is the interpretation you formed of the giant before you even began to fight.
They were sent to observe a promised land, but what did they really find? Giants, fortified cities, or something even more impossible to explain. What did the Israelite spies really see, and why did they return terrified?
There is something extraordinarily modern about the story of the spies in Parashat Shelaj. If one reads it carefully, one discovers that the true problem was not merely a bad report, it was something much deeper. The spies' report did not merely describe a situation, it created one. And here we encounter a fascinating concept from a contemporary perspective. The spies' discourse functions as what we would today call a performative act. That is, words that do not merely inform reality, but words that produce real consequences. Consider this. Up until that moment, the people had not seen Canaan. They had not seen giants, they had not seen walls. Everything they knew depended entirely on the spies' interpretation. And then the leaders return and tell a story laden with fear. Impossible cities, gigantic enemies, inevitable defeat. The result? The biblical text is brutally honest. The people begin to weep. They begin to say, it would have been better to die in Egypt. A nostalgia for slavery emerges. There is even talk of appointing a new leader to lead them back. And finally, an open threat is leveled against Moses and Aaron. Observe the speed of this collapse. In just a few hours, a technical report transforms into a national crisis. Why? Because the report was never neutral. It did not merely inform, it mobilized. It did not merely describe a problem, it generated a collective emotion. And that emotion morphed into political behavior. Here, Shelach becomes almost eerily contemporary. For even today, we witness how words construct realities. An economic speech can generate confidence or panic. A leader can inspire hope or manufacture anxiety. A narrative repeated often enough can transform fear into national identity. The Torah seems to grasp something that social psychology and modern politics would only come to understand much later. Societies do not react solely to facts, they react to the asterisk narratives surrounding those facts. That is why the sin of the spies is not treated merely as a simple military miscalculation. It was not a poor strategic analysis. It was a national rebellion. For when those in authority turn fear into certainty, words cease to be mere opinions and begin to alter the destiny of nations. And perhaps herein lies Shelach's eternal warning. Be wary of the voices you harbor in your mind, for some words do not describe the future, they create it. Now, there is another uncomfortable question that runs through Parashat Shelach, one we rarely dare to ask. What if the spies' fear was not merely spiritual, but also political? For there exists a mystical reading, deeply developed within the Hasidic tradition, and associated with the thought of the asterisk Zohar, that proposes something almost scandalous. Perhaps the spies did not fail out of cowardice. Perhaps they failed because they had too much to lose. Consider this for a moment. In the desert, they were towering figures, spiritual leaders of a nation sustained entirely by miracles. Manna descended from the heavens. Water appeared supernaturally. Clouds of glory shielded the people. There was no agriculture, no complex economy, no state institutions. Everything depended directly upon God. And frankly, leading a miraculous nation carries a certain prestige. But entering the promised land would radically change the rules of the game. Suddenly, they would have to sow crops, to work, to defend borders, to build political systems, to administer justice, to create an economy. In other words, to leave the spiritual desert behind and enter into the complexity of history. And here, the mystical suspicion emerges. Perhaps the spies were not atheists. Perhaps they were not even mere cowards. Their error was far more sophisticated. They desired a spirituality without friction, a faith without land, a relationship with God devoid of politics, commerce, social responsibility, and the uncomfortable burden of building a civilization. Yet the Torah seems to insist upon something radical. God does not wish to remain solely in the desert. He desires to enter the land. He desires to dwell also within agriculture, within the marketplaces, within social justice, within the family, and within the administration of a nation. Israel's great mission was never to escape the world. It was to sanctify the world. And perhaps that is why the formula of this reading is so powerful. The spies wanted God in the wilderness, but they did not want God in history. And if we are honest, that temptation is still alive. For we all, at times, prefer a spirituality that is comfortable, private, risk-free, and devoid of concrete responsibilities. But Shelaj confronts us with an uncomfortable question. Do we want a faith that works only in sacred moments, or a faith capable of entering with us into the real chaos of life? So, there is a Hasidic interpretation of Parashat Shelaj that honestly completely changes the way we understand the sin of the spies. For it posits something deeply human and profound. What if their true fear was not of the giants, but of spiritual descent? Consider the context. The generation of the wilderness lived an almost angelic existence. They did not sow crops, they did not engage in commerce, they didn't have to worry about economics, private property, or complex political systems. Their bread, the manna, descended from heaven. Water appeared miraculously, the clouds of glory protected the people. It was, to use a bit of reverent humor, an all-inclusive spirituality, a permanent spiritual retreat. But entering Eretz Israel would radically alter that religious experience. Suddenly, there would be work, agriculture, business, social conflicts, government, national responsibilities. And that is where the spies' fear arises, according to the Hasidic reading. What will become of our spirituality when we have to get our hands dirty in the real world? For there is something deeply seductive about spirituality when it is free of friction. It is relatively easy to feel spiritually uplifted when everything seems miraculous. The challenge emerges when there are bills to pay, children to raise, conflicts to resolve, and an imperfect world to build. The spies harbored a thought that, if we are honest, many of us still hold today. Perhaps in order to remain holy, one must keep one's distance from the complexities of life. But here, the Torah responds with a radical idea. Judaism does not propose a religion of escapism. It does not teach us to flee from the world. It teaches us to sanctify the world. The mission was never to remain suspended in a spiritual wilderness. The mission was to enter the land, to take the wheat and bake bread with mindfulness, to build markets with integrity, to craft politics with justice, to found families with purpose. In other words, to reveal the sacred within the everyday. That was the error of the spies. They believed that holiness was preserved by avoiding the earth. But the Torah teaches exactly the opposite. True spirituality does not flee from matter. It transforms it. And perhaps the great question of Shelaj is this. Does our faith work only in elevated moments, or can it also survive when Monday morning begins? There is a phrase in Parashat Shelaj that seems like a moment of momentary despair, but in reality, it reveals a much deeper psychological tragedy. After the spies deliver their report, the people say something unthinkable. Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Numbers chapter 14, verse 4. Now, pause for a moment and consider the absurdity of that statement. Return to Egypt? After the slavery? After the whips? After witnessing the parting of the sea? And yet, the Torah seems to hint at something profoundly human. Egypt was not merely a place. It was a mindset. For it is one thing to physically leave Egypt, and quite another to root Egypt out from within oneself. The slave fears freedom, and not because he loves his chains, but because freedom comes at an uncomfortable price. It demands responsibility. It demands risk. It demands building a future without absolute guarantees. In Egypt, everything was terrible, yes, but at least it was predictable. Oppression, paradoxically, offered structure. And here we find a brilliant observation by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who spoke of this as the fear of freedom. The generation of the Exodus could leave Egypt in a single night, but it could not become a mature nation overnight. Physical liberation happens quickly. Inner freedom takes generations. For there exists a very strange psychological paradox. A human being can hate the system that oppresses him, and at the same time miss the emotional security that system provided. It happens even today. People who leave destructive relationships, yet miss the familiarity of the chaos. Societies that criticize oppressive regimes, yet tremble before the uncertainty of autonomy. And that is exactly what happens in Shelaj. In the face of fear, Egypt reappears as a romantic fantasy, not as a reality, as a pathological nostalgia. Memory erases the pain and preserves only the false sense of security. And perhaps here the Torah confronts us with a deeply personal question. How many times have we wanted to return to our own Egypts, to relationships, habits, fears, or old versions of ourselves? Not because they were good, but because they were familiar. For freedom always holds something terrifying. It compels us to grow. And growing, even if it is sacred, is never entirely comfortable. Now, there is another deeply perplexing detail in Parashat Shelaj. When one reads the story of the spies, a question almost inevitably arises. How could a generation that had witnessed so many miracles have failed? Think about it for a moment. We are speaking of people who saw the sea part, who walked between walls of water, who ate manna that descended from the heavens, who drank water in the desert, who lived beneath clouds of glory. Frankly, if anyone had reason to trust, it was they. And yet, when the decisive moment arrived, they said, "We cannot." Then an uncomfortable truth from the Torah emerges. Miracles, in and of themselves, do not produce maturity. Evidence does not always generate trust. For the problem was never a lack of proof of divine intervention. There was proof in abundance. What was lacking was the capacity to translate those experiences into historical trust. The generation had witnessed God's power, but it had not yet developed inner sovereignty. And here we must pause, for this phrase is key. Inner sovereignty. It is the capacity to stand in the face of fear and say, yes, this is difficult, but I will not turn back. The slave expects everything to come from the outside. The free man learns to walk with responsibility. And perhaps that was the true problem of the desert. Israel had physically departed from Egypt, but Egypt had not yet completely departed from Israel. They continued to expect instant miracles. They continued to react from a mindset of dependency. That is why the 40 years in the desert should not be understood solely as punishment. Certainly, there was judgment, but there was also pedagogy. It was a process of historical transformation. A generation forged under servitude could not immediately establish a free, agrarian, politically and spiritually responsible society in the Promised Land. Freedom required training, maturity, character. And perhaps here, Shelaj leaves us with a deeply relevant lesson. Witnessing miracles is not enough. The real question is not how many signs you have received in life. The question is this: have you learned to transform those experiences into confidence when the future still seems uncertain? For mature faith does not subsist solely on miraculous memories. Learn to walk, even when the sea is no longer parting before your eyes. Now, there is one of the most chilling connections in the entire Jewish tradition surrounding Parashat Shelaj. For the Talmud makes a claim that, honestly, shakes the soul. It states that the night the people wept following the report of the spies occurred on asterisk Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And in Ta'anit 29a, a phrase appears that is as brief as it is devastating. God is said to have declared, "You wept a baseless weeping. I will establish for you a weeping for generations to come." Now, we must understand this with depth, for Judaism is not asserting something simplistic, as if God were punishing human tears. The problem was never the act of weeping itself. To weep is human. Weeping can be sacred. Even the truly righteous weep. The question is, from which narrative does one weep? For on that night, the people did not weep solely out of fear. They wept against the promise. They wept as if the covenant had failed. They wept as if the future had been canceled. After witnessing miracles, after the parting of the sea, after the manna, the people chose to interpret the present through the lens of hopelessness. And therein lies the profound insight of the Talmud. Regardless of whether one reads this historically, literally, or symbolically, The rabbinic teaching is extraordinarily powerful. A single night of collective panic can become a spiritual matrix for future tragedies. For collective emotions, too, shape history. And it is no coincidence that tradition links the 9th of Av with some of the deepest wounds of the Jewish people: the destruction of the First Temple, the Second Temple, and other national catastrophes. It is as if fear, left unprocessed, leaves behind a spiritual fissure that cuts across generations. Shelach seems to offer us a warning that is profoundly human. Beware of narratives of collective despair, for a community does not fall merely when it loses territory. Often, it begins to fall when it loses faith in the meaning of its own history. And perhaps that is the uncomfortable question of this parashah. When we weep in the face of fear, do we weep out of legitimate human pain, or out of an inner narrative that has already decided that no redemption is possible? For there are tears that cleanse the soul, and there are tears that, unwittingly, end up fueling despair. There is a verse in Parashat Shelaj that seems plucked straight out of an ancient biblical mystery, and honestly, it has sparked questions for centuries. The spies return and declare, "There we saw the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and to our own eyes we seemed like grasshoppers." Bamidbar 13:33. Now, if you have even a passing familiarity with the Bible, a problem immediately arises. For the Nephilim had already made an appearance earlier, in Bereshit, Genesis, chapter 6, just before the Great Flood. There they are described as mysterious figures, associated with ancient heroes and beings of immense power. And so the question becomes inevitable. Wait a minute, if the flood destroyed that entire world, how do they show up again here, in Canaan? Did they survive? Are we talking about literal giants? Or are the spies simply exaggerating? And here begins one of the most fascinating debates, one that pits tradition against symbolism and both against historical interpretation. Rabbinic tradition preserves accounts of gigantic peoples, the Anakim, the Rephaim, and even figures like Og, king of Bashan. There are midrashim, that preserve memories of colossal, almost legendary beings. Yet not everyone interprets the text literally. Many sages observe something quite intriguing. Perhaps the spies are employing hyperbolic language that borders on propaganda. For it is one thing to say they are strong. It is quite another to say they are the descendants of the Nephilim. Consider the psychological impact. We are no longer speaking of human adversaries. We are speaking of mythical terrors. The narrative takes on an apocalyptic tone. Fear requires monsters. And here a profoundly human interpretation emerges. Perhaps the giants were not merely on the outside. Perhaps they were also on the inside. For the enemy concludes with a revealing phrase, "To our own eyes, we seemed like grasshoppers." Note the sequence. Before the enemy appeared gigantic, they themselves had already become small. And perhaps that is Shelaj's uncomfortable question. How many Nephilim actually exist in our lives? And how many are the result of an imagination amplified by fear? For the human soul knows one thing all too well. When fear takes control, any obstacle can become a giant, and anyone can begin to feel like a grasshopper. When we arrive at the subject of giants in Parashat Shelaj, we must tread with great care. For here, the biblical text enters a territory where history, memory, symbolism, and psychology seem to intermingle. The spies make a startling claim. We saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, of the Nephilim. And so an inevitable question arises. Were they speaking literally, or were they constructing a narrative of terror? Jewish tradition offers several ways to interpret this mystery. The first is the most direct reading, actual giants. Rabbinic literature preserves numerous references to colossal peoples, such as the Anakim and the Rephaim. There also appears the figure of Og, king of Bashan, described as a man of extraordinary dimensions. Some midrashim even preserve fascinating accounts of gigantic beings associated with ancient epics. From this perspective, the spies would not have been fabricating their story entirely. There may indeed have existed a collective memory of physically imposing clans, people so colossal that when compared to them, an army fresh out of slavery would appear insignificant. However, Judaism is rarely content with a single reading. There exists a second possibility, rhetorical exaggeration. And here, the Talmud offers us an important clue. Let us recall that the sages suggest the spies lied, not necessarily about all the facts, but rather about how they interpreted those facts. Thus, some commentators propose something fascinating. Perhaps the reference to the Nephilim is part of an emotional exaggeration. For saying there are strong warriors does not produce the same impact as saying they are descendants of the primordial giants. Observe how fear operates. It is not enough for it merely to describe a danger. It needs to transform that danger into something mythical, into something invincible, into something almost supernatural. The narrative becomes propaganda. The enemy is no longer human. It is transformed into a monster. Yet there remains a third reading, perhaps the most intimate and psychological of all. Perhaps the giants are not merely enormous people. Perhaps they represent fear itself. For the verse concludes in a deeply revealing manner. In our own eyes, we were like grasshoppers. And herein lies the true drama. The text does not merely describe gigantic bodies. It describes a diminished consciousness. First, the enemy grows. Then, the soul shrinks. And when a person begins to view themselves as small, any obstacle seems insurmountable. Perhaps that is the spiritual genius of Shelach. The text never compels us to choose a single interpretation. Perhaps there were actual giants. Perhaps there was exaggeration. Perhaps there was fear. Or perhaps all three occurred simultaneously. For the human heart knows one thing all too well. Even a genuine challenge can morph into a monster. When we allow fear to write the story before hope does.
They were sent to observe a promised land, but what did they really find? Giants, fortified cities, or something even more impossible to explain. What did the Israelite spies really see, and why did they return terrified?
When we arrive at the subject of the Nephilim and the Anakim in Parashat Shelaj, an inevitable question arises. Should we read this text literally, or are we encountering ancient language laden with memory, symbolism, and rhetoric? Modern academic scholarship proposes a fascinating and honestly quite sober reading. According to many scholars of the ancient Near East, references such as the Nephilim, the Anakim, or the Rephaim should be understood within the cultural imaginary of the era. Primordial heroes, legendary warriors, clans of great stature, or ancient peoples remembered as particularly fearsome. And if we think about it, this is not so strange. All ancient civilizations constructed narratives about giants. The Greeks had titans. Mesopotamia spoke of semi-divine heroes. Canaanite and biblical cultures, too, preserved memories of extraordinary, ancient, and powerful peoples. Now, something very interesting occurs in Bamidbar 1333. Some researchers point out that it is precisely here that the connection between the Anakim and the Nephilim appears with particular intensity. Why does that matter? Because it may indicate something profoundly human. The spies were not merely describing a military threat. They were amplifying fear. Observe the mechanism. It was not enough to say, there are strong peoples. It was not enough to say, their cities are difficult to conquer. The language had to be elevated to the level of mythical terror. They are descendants of the Nephilim. In other words, we are not facing mere enemies. We are facing something almost superhuman. And here, academic scholarship introduces an important idea. This type of discourse can function as military hyperbole. Something akin to when, in modern parlance, someone says, "That problem is monstrous." It does not necessarily signify a literal monster. It means that fear has magnified the perception of the obstacle. One might also speak of legendary memory, of ancient tribal traditions, or even of an etiology, a narrative explanation as to why certain peoples were remembered as particularly intimidating. But here, it is fitting to pause for a moment of intellectual honesty. The biblical text, read with seriousness, offers no sufficient basis for modern extreme theories regarding genetic hybrids, extraterrestrials, hidden civilizations, or secret races. And yes, the internet can be very creative, sometimes too creative. But a rigorous reading, both academic and rabbinic, counsels prudence. For the text's focus never seems to lie in fantastical biology. Its focus lies elsewhere, in how fear transforms enemies into monsters, in how a generation can begin to feel small in the face of an immense future. And perhaps that is the great lesson. The most dangerous giants are not always those that objectively exist. Sometimes they are the stories that fear fabricates within us, until it convinces us that the promise is impossible. Now, when we arrive at the account of the spies in Bamidbar, Numbers 13 and 14, a question arises that has intrigued not only the rabbis, but also modern scholars. Why does the text seem to recount two slightly different versions of the same story? For if one reads carefully, an interesting tension emerges. In Bamidbar, it appears that God takes the initiative. The text begins with a clear command, Shalach lecha anashim, send men to explore the land. Everything seems simple. But then, 40 years later, in Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 1, Moses recalls the events and states something different. It was the people who asked to send scouts before entering. And so the inevitable question arises, who actually proposed the mission? God, Moses, or the people? Rabbinic tradition, as we saw earlier, typically resolves this tension through interpretation. God permitted something that the people desired. There is no contradiction. Rather, there are different perspectives on the same event. However, modern biblical criticism proposes a different explanation. Many scholars observe that these differences may reflect the combination of distinct textual traditions that, over time, were integrated into a single narrative. Here, we enter the realm of what is known as documentary criticism. According to this perspective, parts of the Torah preserve diverse literary voices, stemming from ancient traditions that were subsequently interwoven by final redactors. For instance, scholars such as Richard Elliott Friedman suggest that the account of the spies contains elements associated with different textual strands, some linked to the priestly style, more structured and institutional, and others associated with older traditions, frequently referred to as Yahwist. Simply put, the text we possess today may be the result of two narrative memories that were carefully preserved and unified. One version would emphasize divine initiative, the other, human responsibility. And academic sites like thetorah.com summarize this stance by stating that Numbers the 13th to the 14th of May have been constructed from earlier accounts, integrated by a final redactor. Now, it is worth taking a moment here to pause and catch one's intellectual breath, for this type of reading does not necessarily seek to undermine the text's spirituality. Rather, it seeks to understand how the text came to be formed. Tradition asks, what does God wish to teach us? Academic criticism asks, how did this text come into existence? These are distinct questions, and perhaps most interestingly, both identify the very same textual mystery. One resolves it through theology, the other through literary history. Yet both ultimately point to something fascinating. Even the internal complexity of the narrative seems to reinforce the moral ambiguity of the mission. For perhaps Shelaj intends for us to remain unsettled, left to wonder whether the spies were dispatched out of faith or out of fear disguised as prudence. There is a question that inevitably arises when we study Parashat Shelaj in depth. What do we do with the tensions within the biblical text? For if we are intellectually honest, they are certainly there. In Bamidbar, Numbers, it appears that God initiates the sending of the spies. In Devarim, Deuteronomy, Moses recalls that it was the people who requested it. Thus emerges a fascinating bifurcation between two major ways of reading the Torah, the traditional reading and academic criticism. And here, I wish to make an important point. These are not necessarily adversaries. They are distinct questions examining the very same phenomenon. The traditional reading proceeds from a fundamental premise. The Torah possesses a revealed unity. That is to say, the text forms a coherent whole, even when internal tensions appear to exist. So, how do the sages resolve this discrepancy? Through interpretation. For instance, commentators such as Rashi explain that God permitted something that people desired. Shelach lecha, send for yourself, implies an authorization rather than a divine imperative or ideal command. The people asked. Moses agreed. God permitted it. And in Devarim, 40 years later, Moses recounts the event from a different pedagogical perspective, emphasizing human responsibility. The tension exists, yet it possesses theological significance. It is not a contradiction, it is depth. It is a single event viewed from distinct angles. Academic criticism, however, poses a completely different question. It does not ask, first and foremost, what is its spiritual significance? Instead, it asks, how was this text composed? From this vantage point, these tensions need not necessarily be harmonized. Rather, they may serve as traces of a literary process, distinct traditions, preserved memories, integrated ancient versions. Final editors who wove diverse voices into a complex narrative. From this perspective, the discrepancies between Bamidbar and Devarim would be indicators of compositional history. Not a problem to be solved, but rather a clue as to how the text came into being. And here, something fascinating emerges. Both readings detect the exact same phenomenon. Both perceive the tension. The difference lies in the explanation. The rabbinic tradition suggests there is a spiritual intention embedded within the apparent contradiction. Academic criticism responds, there are literary layers and historical memory underlying that tension. But there exists a third possibility, a very intriguing one, an integrated literary reading. The idea that perhaps the ambiguity is deliberate, perhaps the text intends to unsettle us. Perhaps the question was never who was to blame, but rather, did the mission stem from faith or from fear disguised as prudence? And perhaps therein lies the genius of the Torah, a text so profound that it can withstand difficult questions. For spiritual truth does not always fear complexity. Sometimes, that is precisely where the deepest conversation begins. After studying Parashat Shelaj from so many angles, psychological, political, rabbinic, mystical, and academic, the great question finally arises. So, what exactly was the sin of the spies? For, if we are honest, it does not seem to have been merely a bad report. It was not just fear. It was not just cowardice. The Torah seems to present something far deeper, almost a multi-dimensional failure of the collective soul. We could summarize it in 7 levels. First, the epistemological level. The spies confused perception with truth. They saw giants and concluded that victory was impossible. But seeing something large does not automatically mean it is invincible. Perception became a verdict. Second, the narrative level. They constructed a story of defeat before the battle had even been fought. They did not say, it will be difficult. They said, we will not be able to do it. And an entire nation began to live inside that story. For people rarely act based solely on facts. They act based on the story they believe about the facts. Third, the theological level. The problem was not merely military, it was spiritual. After the Exodus, the parting of the sea, and the manna, they interpreted reality as if God were no longer present. Deep down, they voiced something very dangerous. The promise will not withstand contact with reality. Fourth, the political level. They destabilized the entire community. A single report transformed into a national crisis. The people wept, wished to return to Egypt, and began to question the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Fifth, the psychological level. They projected their own inner sense of inferiority onto the enemy. We were like grasshoppers. First, they felt small themselves, and then they imagined that everyone else saw them that way too. Sixth, the ethical level. They manipulated actual data to instill fear. They did not completely fabricate the facts, but they did arrange the information in such a way as to manufacture hopelessness. And finally, the seventh level, the mystical. They rejected the entry of holiness into the land. They wanted God in the wilderness, amidst miracles, but not within agriculture, politics, work, and human history. And perhaps herein lies the most profound insight of Shelach. The sin of the spies was not seeing giants. It was allowing the giants to loom larger than the promise. For a nation can survive enormous challenges, but it can hardly survive when it loses the capacity to believe that the future can still be redeemed. After this entire journey through Parashat Shelaj, perhaps we can now state one thing with clarity. This is not merely a story about failed espionage. It is not a military report gone awry. It is not an ancient anecdote about biblical geography. It is something far more profound. Shelach is, perhaps, one of the most powerful treatises in the entire Torah regarding the power of interpretation. For observe something extraordinary. The spies did not destroy Israel with weapons. There was no war. There was no invasion. There was no military defeat. They destroyed a generation with a narrative. That was the true battlefield. And here we must be very precise. The spies did not deny that the land was good. In fact, they confirmed exactly what God had promised. The land was fertile, abundant, flowing with milk and honey. The problem did not lie with the land. The problem lay within them. For the spies' true message was this: the promise is beautiful, but we are not up to the task. And that is where the catastrophe began. They did not deny the future. They denied their own capacity to inhabit that future. And that is devastating. For a person, a community, and even a nation can survive external enemies for a very long time. They can withstand wars, crises, scarcity, literal giants. But there is something far more difficult to survive: an internal narrative of smallness. When leaders themselves teach their people to view themselves as grasshoppers, the collapse has already begun. For first, trust is lost. Then, vision is lost. And finally, the courage to move forward is lost. Shelach, then, does not speak only of them. It speaks of us, of the stories we repeat regarding our own limitations, of the giants we magnify, of the promises we abandon before ever attempting to reach them. And perhaps the final question of this parashah is a deeply personal one. Who is narrating your life? Is it fear? The memory of your failures? Or the possibility that, even when facing real giants, there still exists a promise greater than your fears? For the message of asterisk Shelach is both unsparing and, at the same time, full of hope. Giants exist, but what truly determines the destiny of a generation is the story it chooses to believe about itself. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. This has been Abel Flores, journalist and founder of Mishnah TV. Thank you for subscribing to the channel, if you haven't done so already, for giving us a like, and for visiting us at our website, lamishnah.com. And so that you may continue your studies with us, here are a couple of videos I'd like to share with you. Shalom.